When I first became interested in art history, it was because of the album Ceremonials by Florence and the Machine. The band's frontwoman Florence Welch was well-versed in the subject herself because of her Renaissance art historian mother, and it showed in her work. Ceremonials was a dark, grand, Baroque pop record with visuals to accompany the lyrics that Welch crafted about her experience with loneliness and grief. I feel like this album shaped my preferences for art, as I tend to favor darker, dramatic, more storied pieces about the woes of womanhood or how the lines made with a body or face can tell a story. When I visited the Getty Center earlier in the semester, I went in without knowing what to expect out of the exhibits outside of a fashion photography one that was on display. While many of the pieces of art appeared lighter or less serious in context, like the tranquil gardens outside and sketches of the ocean or buildings, I was gravitating towards works like Joseph Wright of Derby's Penelope Unraveling Her Web or Paul Cézanne's Young Italian Woman at a Table. These works told the story of isolation or anguish through the expressions and light. The two pieces that I was captivated by the most happened to be made by a man and woman who I later learned happened to have interesting pasts separately and with each other. The first sculpture that I was drawn to was the torso of a crouching woman by Camille Claudel. Claudel was a French sculptor who primarily worked with bronze and marble. She began working with clay at a young age, and after the encouragement of her father and a neighbor who was an artist named Alfred Brocher, she sought out an education in the arts. After an education with Brocher as her mentor, she met Auguste Rodin. Under Rodin, she became his mentee, and they became each other's muses while they also had an affair. Despite her talent and the encouragement of those around her, she was never able to win the approval of her mother, who said that Claudel had an unladylike desire to become an artist. After her affair with Rodin ended and the death of her father, she suffered more with her mental health. This resulted in her destroying many of her works before ultimately being committed to a psychiatric hospital, where she remained until her death 30 years later. In her life, Claudel felt underappreciated as an artist by the general public and even those who were closest to her, including Rodin. Her relationship with Rodin was helpful but also hindering. Because of the context of her work, she was not able to get the financial support she needed, but because of her proximity to Rodin, he was able to assist her, but he would get the credit. For instance, to get a clay maquette made in bronze, you needed the funding and the approval of the official institute. When the inspectors visited Claudel's studio, they refused to give her permission to cast the waltz because it showed two nude bodies in close proximity. The very idea was not acceptable from a woman's hand, whereas from Rodin's hand, work influenced by Claudel's darling became acceptable as men are allowed to know about sexual desire and the body. After learning about her immense talent and tumultuous life, my initial interest in this piece grew. I was first drawn to the sculpture because of the emotion behind it. Despite the fact that there is no face on the sculpture, the way that the body is positioned makes you believe that the subject might be going through something painful. The Getty describes the pose shown on the piece as contorted and that its fragmentary nature emanate expressions of pain, solitude, or fear. The sculpture is made of bronze and shows a naked female body crouched without arms, a head, or its left knee. Both feet are firmly planted, and the back of the woman is shown hunched over with bones from the spine and ribcage showing. When you take Claudel's background into consideration, it makes the sculpture more impactful. It is a miracle that the sculpture is still even in existence, as Claudel destroyed many of her works in times of mental distress. But this piece, being one of the ones that remains in existence, feels like it was either on purpose or somehow fated to illustrate the hardships she faced under Rodin or her family. Since many sculptures or art in general of women who were nude were done by men because of censorship laws, they tended to romanticize the subjects of their art. Male artists would depict women from their outsider view instead of women getting the chance to show how they really felt simply because of these censorship laws. The likes of Alfred Brocher and Auguste Rodin had tendencies to overlay emotional reality and lived experience with projections of fantasy and a finishing sheen of beauty, and as such they neglected to explore meaning or to move away from outdated neoclassical and imperial styles. It was Claudel who was keen to experiment, influenced by Art Nouveau and Japanese prints. Her sculpture became expressionist. The sculpture is impactful for many reasons, but my main takeaway was the fact that she was able to create a nude sculpture made out of bronze that showed vulnerability despite everything that could have prevented its existence in the first place. The sculpture has elements that show the inspiration of ancient Greek sculptures that came before it, while adding elements that Claudel worked hard to perfect that depict emotion through lines in the sculpture. The bones shown underneath the skin of the sculpture are the most interesting to me, as it shows how crouched over the subject is and how she might be unwell because of how her body looks and how it is curled in on itself. If you ignore the possibility that Claudel channeled her own experiences into the sculpture, it can still be interpreted as an artist having the ability to use materials to create a three-dimensional display of vulnerability through her grasp of human anatomy. The sculpture being bronze also lets the light reflect off of it in a way that it would not with marble, so the shadows highlight every crevice that she sculpted. Claudel's impact might not have been evident at the time of the creation of this piece or her short-lived career that came to an end upon her admittance for psychiatric care, but its impact lives on. She was an expert in a field that was rare for a woman to break into at the time, and she went against the norms and rules to show her art. The other piece of art that I was drawn to happened to be by Claudel's mentor and former lover, Auguste Rodin. Placed adjacent to torso of a crouching woman, Rodin's sculpture entitled Christ and Mary Magdalene caught my attention. I was initially drawn to it because of the subject matter, since Mary Magdalene is a figure who I have been interested in for years. The sculpture is made of marble, and upon first glance it is slightly difficult to tell what is being portrayed in the piece. Rodin made the piece with the intention of having different interpretations outside of religion. Augustine Rodin titled the piece Christ and Mary Magdalene, but he also called it Prometheus and the Oceanade and the Genius and Pity, opening up composition to multiple biblical, mythical, and secular associations. These themes, mixing the sacred and profane, relate to Rodin's conception of the creative life, which in his view inevitably involved suffering and martyrdom. Rodin began working with clay before he worked with marble and bronze. Many of his works that were in bronze showed his skill at carving out anatomy of a human body and its emotion through body language. Christ and Mary Magdalene, like many of his other marble pieces, did not seem as detailed as the artworks that he did in bronze. The two figures in the sculpture are more detailed than the marble that surrounds them, as that marble seems like it is just there to hold them up. The compelling strength of this work results from the stark contrast between highly polished surfaces of the naked flesh and the surrounding rough-hewn marble. Rodin admired Michelangelo's sculptures during his visit to Florence in 1876, and the artist's influence on Rodin can be seen not only in the unfinished parts of this piece, but also in the dramatically contorted female body. Even though there isn't as much detail on this compared to his works made of bronze, he is still able to show the suffering that Mary Magdalene faced as she witnesses Christ's crucifixion. Because of the influence of artists like Donatello and Michelangelo, and the fact that he made pieces that were life-size, Rodin was often accused of plagiarism. The Age of Bronze was an example of this. The statue's apparent lack of a theme was troubling to critics, commemorating neither mythology nor a noble historical event, and it is not clear whether Rodin intended a theme. Because of accusations like this, he began to make his art on a larger or smaller scale to avoid this. Christ and Mary Magdalene is a robust piece, but the subjects in the work are smaller than the average human. It is also one of his few works that was not cast in bronze. While it is commonly known for its name in regards to its religious interpretations, the sculpture is vague enough to allow that as an interpretation, while allowing for other interpretations. At first glance, what appears to be a male figure is shown with a distressed look on his face, with his arms outstretched, almost as if it is Christ dying on the cross. The nude figure clinging to him appears female. Her face is not visible at any angle, but her agony is evident because of her body language as she hangs off of the body in front of her. The ambiguity of the sculpture is what is appealing to me, because if you look at the piece from any angle other than head-on, it looks just like a piece of marble without any obvious efforts being put into it. The roughness of the marble and the ambiguity of both of the subjects, especially the female figure, adds to the appeal of the work. This piece is impactful in a different way and stood out from Rodin's other pieces because of its ambiguity. If you were to view any of his other pieces, especially those that were cast in bronze, you can see the details that he focused on with human anatomy and expression, while Christ and Mary Magdalene relies on the viewer's previous knowledge of the figures or religious figures in general. The unfinished quality of the piece added to the ambiguity. Since Rodin was in such high demand, he would rely on his marble carvers to bring his vision to life. The sculpture was entrusted to Rodin's primary marble carver, Victor Peter, a well-regarded artist himself, though Rodin oversaw the process, even drawing on photographs to indicate how he wanted details altered. Even with less details in his bronze work, you can still see how skilled he was from the lines on the bodies and the expression on Christ's face. What drew me to both sculptures was the ability to convey emotion without obvious facial expression, especially in the case of Claudel's piece, as it has no face at all. Learning about both artists and their tumultuous relationship with each other adds a layer of complexity to the meaning of each sculpture. Rodin was a man who was allowed to depict Mary Magdalene nude and suffering with realism, while Claudel had to deal with criticisms and censorship laws to depict the same thing through her art. Torso of a Crouching Woman is said to have been influenced by Rodin because it showed how she grasped the expressive potential of a fragment of the human body from his works. Rodin's works are said to have changed after he began to work with Claudel. Claudel biographer Audelie Irel-Claus states Rodin's work became a lot more sensual during their relationship. His impact on her work often overshadowed her craft. Rodin used his art world stature to introduce journalists to Claudel's work. But these critics searched tirelessly for Rodin's style in her sculptures, looking for traces of the master rather than judging the work on its own merits. Both artists benefited from each other, but it can also be argued that Rodin benefited more as he was not held back as much as Claudel was financially and ultimately creatively. These pieces in tandem encapsulate each artist and their struggle. Rodin and his claims of plagiarism and early issues with funding, and Claudel and the struggle to depict simple human emotion and anatomy.